Welcome to the Conscious Economics Podcast. I'm your host, Rhiannon Rosalind. I'm a serial entrepreneur and social innovator. I like to gather people from all different walks to talk about what I call the conscious economy. I believe that we can create a more equitable system, one that honors the well-being of people, the well-being of the planet, the well-being of business, and includes art and creativity. Join us each week as we tackle a different intersection of this big but critical conversation. What's up, everyone? We are officially in season 2 of the Conscious Economics Podcast. I am your host, Rhiannon Rosalind. I'm the creator and founder of Conscious Economics, and we are here today joined with a really good friend of mine and an amazing person who's doing cool things in the world, of course. So Andre Forsythe is the founder and executive director, of the Canadian Climate Challenge, and he's the project lead on the School for Climate. So Andre, now you and I are sitting around talking about these issues all the time, but today we're here to really, share with our audience. Tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming what I call a social innovator, because that's how I see you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. And yes, we are often talking about these issues. So I'm glad to actually finally make it onto the Conscious Economics. My journey to becoming a social innovator is long. I've been around a long time. But some of the most prominent moments for me that I think really changed my path, specifically relating to the economy, is I used to be a BCom student at McMaster. And I remember sitting in an economics class, and this is what changed my major from BCom to poli-sci, was sitting in there and listening to the professor list all of the externalities that were outside of our economic system. And they're all the things that mattered most. First and foremost, nature. So we have an entire economic system that is predicated on externalizing the impacts on nature. And that way I'm like, hold on, how is this supposed to work for us?
Right.
And that for me was one of the key moments that was like switched me and literally changed my major within the next 6 months. I'm like, no, I need to be on the front lines of something that's really more connected in our reality and functioning within that. So
wow. You know what? That's really profound. And I do think, and I mean, we're here right now, we're sitting here at Conscious Economics. And again, Conscious Economics trying to say that economic system, that economic framework, it has to change. It has to enlighten itself. It has to start to include some of these other pieces, and nature being, right in that wheelhouse of our planet pillar, and really leading me to talk about the work that you're doing right now. So can you talk a little bit about Canadian Climate Challenge and what are you guys trying to do? What is the, what's the thesis of the organization?
Yeah, of course. And so you mentioned both the two kind of separate areas that we work in is Canadian Climate Challenge and School for Climate. And Canadian Climate Challenge preceded the founding of the School for Climate project. And Canadian Climate Challenge was founded based on a real connection with the inequity in the climate space, the climate conversation, climate action, access to events, access to knowledge, access to empowerment, and a real understanding of what we were facing. As clearly a Black person, a person of color, in growing up in Toronto, I was more fortunate than a lot of people in terms of my access to education and upward mobility. And even for me, the relation to how the climate emergency and impacts were going to be particularly hitting our communities, communities of color.
Yeah.
That link has not been made at all. And I remember transitioning from different social groups, which I was lucky to do, there was a complete disconnection. Meanwhile, in the home countries where a lot of folks come from, they're on the front lines.
Yeah.
And so this disconnection for me was huge, and the first thing I could think of that I could do was starting Canadian Climate Challenge is how do we make access to these events more equitable? So the first thing we did when we launched Canadian Climate Challenge is essentially it's a site that aggregates all the climate events and actions that are taking place around the GTA. So whether it's finance related, whether it's a park cleanup,
so I can go there and I can see what's happening
Absolutely.
In my community and I can get involved.
Absolutely.
That's so cool.
100%. And then going to most of them, because most of them are downtown in the middle of the day. Who can go to
Who can do that?
And so then we went to each of those events and started live streaming them or creating social content so people could connect with that messaging, which is just kind of a small step. But
it's actually huge.
Yeah.
And it's, again, I think why we connected so deeply is because I'm so passionate about opening up accessibility ability for people to talk about the economy, to talk about climate, to talk about these things. And it's true, there's all these barriers for many different groups that make them feel like they're not a part of that conversation. And we can kind of get into that because I think that that is a juicy kind of nugget. But before we do, I just want to talk about the School for Climate because this is such a badass project.
Yes.
And definitely
Thank
something
you.
that like, I know it's really good. So tell us a little bit about that because I think our audience will be interested.
For sure. And so the next step after Canadian Climate Challenge, we started the School for Climate. So the School for Climate is a collective of artists who we've brought into the conversation to try and convey a collective narrative. The shift that we need to change in our cultural stories is not going to be accurately conveyed to most folks through articles in
like
the Globe and
data
Mail.
and
Like that, there's no emotional connection to that most of
Right.
the time. And what's missing from COP26, what's missing from every political party that has tried to represent Canada, there's no overwhelming narrative that conveys that we're all together and expresses that in a way that is solutions oriented and positive and for us to move forward together. And so when we thought of how do we convey this, what better way than art and musician, which I know you totally get. And
This
so,
is why we have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what the School for Climate is. We try and create kind of creative engagements, whether it's a mural, whether 70 by 40 foot mural like we have in Oshawa, whether it's the complete immersive climate solutions environment that we're creating at U of T at the moment. We really want to find a way to connect that story with folks in a more visceral and an emotional way.
So people get to go into these immersive art experiences that you and your incredible collective are creating, and they get to actually feel and experience climate change and climate solutions as opposed to just reading about them in a book. I think that's so progressive. And I love, again, it's activating our art pillar here. We really, really believe that emotive piece has to be there in order to create collective change. So I just love what you're doing. I love that you always rep the medicine wheel. I love that you're like holding that prayer of unity and you continue to kind of fight for that. It gives me such hope, to be quite honest, because now let's get into the topic that we were speaking about where groups have been left out of this conversation. And predominantly the groups that have been let out of this conversation happen to be groups that are racialized, that have been marginalized. And for me, I know I show up as a white woman, but I was raised in poverty and I watched my family struggle to put food on the table. And I watched my family struggle with many, many different things that were economic, that this idea of saving the planet or making these changes, it was like almost a kind of a joke. It was like, are you kidding me? And I speak to a lot of people who still feel very removed from it. Like it was this elitist, almost rich white movement at some point, although the planet is an asset for all of us. And like you said, those that are marginalized tend to be most impacted by climate. Even just around the world, when we look at climate migration and all of these things, we see the countries that are most impacted. So tell me, I guess, in your own way, is this really shifting? How far do we have to go? Is it a generational piece? Like I just want to know what you think.
Yes, all of the above.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest shift that we see in that narrative is the prevalence of the climate justice perspective now.
Okay.
I think that's one of the most recognizable changes from the way that the conversation used to be.
Yes.
And all environmentally based. And then now we're talking about climate justice and the way that this needs to be a social justice program.
Yes.
That if it's going to have any sort of chance of success. And I think what we're talking about essentially is at the root of this is there's no one who benefits from a system that is so deeply entrenched in inequity and inequality. Mm-hmm. Whether that's on an environmental basis, whether that's on a financial basis, we're seeing the limitations of that approach. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's taking longer for the folks who have benefited most from this inequitable system. It's taking longer for them to get that. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, the folks who are most impacted by those negative impacts are also similarly being disconnected from that information. And so it's no wonder that things are moving so slowly or have traditionally moved so slowly. And so that's what we see as the real challenge, is to convey that there's the inequity here is what has to be solved in whatever solution. And the limits that we all experience for success, for growth, for everyone is limited by that inequity. Just like that, like when you're on the Titanic and it's all going down, it doesn't matter. Like, you're all confined by inequity.
Yes.
And so that's what we're hoping we can convey.
I think that's so powerful. And, you know, I have to admit, and I know I think I've admitted this to you, but I'm going to admit it to you again right here, that I have a lot of, I don't know what it is. I feel like I have a lot of, I don't know if it's low self-worth or like I'm nervous about the climate piece more because I have felt so traditionally disconnected from it. Although I care so deeply about it, I also feel very much like a hypocrite a lot of the times because I'm still driving a car. I'm still like functioning in a system that I know is not the way it should be, but it's also entrenched in your every single day, you know, process, that I do feel a little bit like a hypocrite. And I think it keeps a lot of people on the sidelines because they're like, oh, I'm not perfect, or I'm not like, I'm not showing up brown bagging it every day, or whatever it is, whatever your notion of it is. So I don't belong there, or like I can't be a part of this. And sometimes, you know, within the movement, I think there's this swath or this spread of folks. I think there's people that are like legitimately deeply living in a different way and are like, forget it, I'm going to be that example. And then there's other people on the fringe that are interested, want to be invited in, but also feel trepidatious. And, you know, even for the position that I held at the Economic Club of Canada for over a decade, I did a lot of work with all the natural resource organizations and all of these things. And I was immersed in the business talk of it all for so long. And so again, it made me feel very uninvited to the party of the movement. And I still kind of put my toe in and out. And so for me, the place where I found my most connection is actually just being in nature. Starting there, not to be perfect, not to have everything figured out, not to know and memorize all the facts, but to say, I'm going to make a concerted effort to try and spend more time in nature and reconnect. And that's how I'm tackling that piece for myself right now. But is this a common sentiment? Like, how do you feel about it? Because you're in it, you represent it now. So do you feel like you have to show up a very particular way, or is that just innate to you at this point?
Well, I think one of the things that I love about myself, thank you very much, is I feel like the definition of imperfection. Like you don't have to know me for very long to see how honest I am about what I don't know, what I need to learn, mistakes that I've made, often I've made very openly, very publicly. And I think that we need more people like that, or more people in general who are okay with that. We need to eradicate this idea of perfection. That if we're waiting for a perfect system to replace what we have now, then we might as well give up now.
Right.
It's going to take everybody, and I think that's part of the approach that we take with the School for Climate. So right now, one of the things we're doing, for example, is murals. And murals obviously we like the idea of murals because there's a permanence associated with them and a community connection with them. And so we try, whenever we're doing a mural, we try and make sure that the content of that mural connects with the folks in that community and with some of the solutions that are most relevant and empowering for them. Because I think that's where we're missing for a lot of people is, where do people feel power? It's not just at home and in their families. It's in their communities. It's in their places of worship. It's in their industries. And how do you reach people with the structural change and the actions that can support that change is what's important. We have to reach them there. We have to reach them that way. And that sense of community and collective action is really where we need to be in order to move anything forward, and that collective thought process together. And so I think that has been fundamental for us, and anyone who is trepidatious about joining, I think that's the way you reach those folks, is connecting them into the community, showing them how their community can work together, and then it's a lot easier to take that step when you've got a few folks.
I love that, and I love, like, it means a lot for me to see someone like yourself at the forefront of this particular part of the movement and this organization. There was really an invitation that came when I met someone like you who, like you said, was so open and honest and didn't feel polarizing on either side, but was really welcoming this big tent kind of idea where, like, we are all welcome, and the art piece really being a universal language that everyone can connect to. And that, to me, like, that's where I was like, okay, I'm onto this. Like, I want to be involved and support you because that resonates really deeply with me. And I love that. Hold that thought. We have a quick word from our partners before going back to the episode. This podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, RBC Investies. Backed by expert human advisors, RBC Investies is a smart, online, automated investment service that allows you to invest with low effort and low cost.
Open your first RBC Investies account and pay no management fees for your first year. Plus, start investing with as little as $100. Simply visit rbcinvesties.com/getinvesting and sign up using promo code AA407.
And now back to the episode. So for everyone that's watching right now at home, what are some tangible things that we can do to support the movement, to pique our curiosity? What would you suggest for the listeners that maybe don't know where they fit into the whole movement, but want to kind of take a stab into something?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. There's a plethora of things that people can do. And I think number one, I think for me was trying to connect with what do I feel most comfortable doing? My pathway into, before I started Canadian Climate Challenge, I was working in sustainable fashion. I didn't start my career in sustainable fashion, but as I started to learn more about what needed to change, that was the industry that I was functioning in. So I think easiest for most people, if you're looking to engage in collective change, which I think is where you should, is thinking about, okay, what community are you a part of? What industry are you a part of? And trying to familiarize yourself with what changes need to take place in that industry. We worked with, a reference to Oshawa again, we did a Just Transition mural in Oshawa in partnership with Green Jobs Oshawa, who is part of the union at the GM plant, and with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers.
So you're working with the unions, you're working with the unions that run the GM plant. Let's stop and really let this sink in for a second, because this is really unbelievable to me. And so this is all in the spirit of just transition. Can you explain what just transition means?
Yes, of course. So just transition, although there's a lot of definitions for it, at the root is as we transition our major systems that are entrenched in kind of propping up our current way of living, normally related to fossil fuel production, energy production, where those are some of the major areas that we know need to shift. And as we shift those, a just transition makes sure that when we do so, obviously we think of the technological shift that's required in order to do so, but to make sure that the people who are currently working within these industries have a place in that future. So that transition to a future structure is based on justice. And we have to think in these ways when we're connecting with the folks who currently live and work and livelihoods are in these industries.
And see, this is what I love, because this is economic innovation at the core of what you're doing. And again, thinking about all the folks, and I grew up in a household of, union workers who were very much fundamental, like labor rights folks and whatever else. And so access to good jobs and good benefits and good pay is something that many of these industries have been affording people for a long time in this country.
Absolutely.
That's a reality. Manufacturing, this is it has been a big backbone, especially for Ontario. So when we talk about that just transition, knowing that we need justice for the planet, so we need to transition the way that we do things. But we also need to ensure that people are still going to be able to transition over to good paying jobs, to good opportunities to put, food on the table for their families, while still being able to create something that's more sustainable and making these deep systemic changes. So I love that project so much. I think it's so cool. To end off, because we are here at Conscious Economics, can you talk a little bit about your climate finance stuff that you guys are doing? Because I think that is just so, I know so many people, they hear climate finance and they're like, what even is that? So can you explain to us what that is?
Absolutely. So when it comes to the climate finance work that we are doing, it's very confusing for people, and therefore most people are very subject to easily being greenwashed as to what is the future of finance industry need to look like. How much $100 million sounds like a lot to some people. $100 billion to pledge for the at COP26 sounds like a lot. Those are drops in the bucket. And so the familiarity that most people have with finance is so broad that greenwashing is so easy to take place. And so I think what we are trying to do with the School for Climate is to identify what are the primary principles that you need to, in Canada, you need to see the finance industry committed to actually then qualify that as climate finance. How much equity needs to be at the backbone of what their commitments are. Commitment both locally and nationally, but also globally. And what our intention is to do is identify what are those 4 pillars that represent the climate finance industry's goals in Canada, and then fill the finance neighborhood with images of what that looks like.
Yeah.
And so that way people are less susceptible to being to greenwashing and are empowered to say, okay, I work at RBC, I work at CIBC, I work at TD, and I know that I'm not seeing these from my organization. And so if I want to work at an organization that is in the future of finance, which that's what's happening. Yeah. All the young generation who's going into finance and leaving university now understand that a financial system that is predicated on deep imbalance and exploitation has its limits. We've seen those limits, and it's a mature approach to the future of finance is indigenizing the economy, is having more visible minority representation, not as a subset, but as the base of resilience for an economic system that is in tuned enough with the balance that we see in our environment to say that it is even remotely sustainable. So that, I think, we really want to fill that neighborhood and make it welcoming.
I love this project so much. Again, of course, I've worked with Bay Street for years. I've worked with Corporate Canada for years. I know that there are many, many progressive folks that are working within these institutions that want to see change, that want to see that happen. And I think you are, again, helping people to be educated, helping people to understand where their rights are, where their ability to mobilize is, but also in this respectable way where you're actually inviting the institutions to the table. You're working with the institutions. You know, it's not about this dichotomy of like us versus them or whatever. It's how do we all come together for that cause? So on that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming into the studio today, Andre. For anyone who's interested in getting involved or finding out more, where can people find you? So
first of all, I want to thank you. You can find us on Instagram at the School for Climate, schoolforclimate.com, and CanadianClimateChallenge.ca. Those are the best places to keep up with our work. And if I could just say one thing, Rhiannon, one of the things that for me, why I connected to you right off the bat, as you alluded to, you've been working inside of the financial system for quite a while now. And I think it's very common that we have these narratives that are us versus them, outside, inside. And I think we need to be clear, and I think you've been very clear about this from the day that I met you, is we need everybody. 150%. And as much as this conversation sounds and seems polarized and people want to get defensive, really what the goal here is to create a system where we can all see ourselves in.
Yes.
And so I really hope that everyone on side of that message, even if you're inside the financial institution, if you're outside of it, I want folks to not lose sight of the fact that what we're trying to move forward to is better for all of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Prayer of unity, keep marching. We are in this together. We're on this planet together. It's our job to save it together. It's our job to save ourselves together. And we can.
Oh, absolutely.
So yes.
And we will.
Yeah. And we will. Okay, well, we'll have to have you back to talk about this some more. But thank you again. For those of you tuning in right now, you can check the show notes for any of those handles or websites that Andre just mentioned. And if you're more interested in some of the stuff that Conscious Economics is doing as well, you can check out our website at consciouseconomics.ca. See you again next week. Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by CPP Investments. At CPP Investments, they never lose sight of the long term. They invest the Canadian Pension Plan Fund to help provide financial security for generations of Canadians.
They diversify the CPP fund across geographies and asset classes to access the best investment opportunities and generate sustainable long-term returns. The fund is now more than $400 billion.
To learn more about their investment performance for Canadians, visit cppinvestments.com.